Hello, everyone. This is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas. And if you enjoy it, please check out my channel page to see what YouTube might not be suggesting to you. In 1953, Karl Popper gave a lecture for later publication about his work in the philosophy of science. It introduced his theories on the topic of what he calls conjectures and refutations, relating to the way that science operates. This is included in his later book by the same title. It is also included in anthologies, including the Challenges to Empiricism anthology, where empiricism refers to the idea that our knowledge of the world has its origin in sense experience. There are two problems that Popper looks to address in his lecture. The first is the question of demarcation, which is the question of how we are to distinguish between genuine science and pseudoscience. The second is the problem of induction, by which we understand that inferences of a rule or natural law based on sense experience assume that the future will be like the past. As a result, we cannot be certain that our theories based on observation will always continue to show the same pattern. This leads contemporary scientists to regard their theories as somewhat tentative. Popper does not pretend he can save science from this in any complete sense, but he will argue that even though scientific experiment cannot prove a theory to be absolutely true, it can nevertheless disprove a hypothesis. This will have implications in terms of the respect that should be given to genuine science. Popper starts with the question of when a theory should be ranked as scientific. He wants to emphasize that this is not a question of truth, because error is possible in science, and pseudoscience can accidentally stumble upon truth. The accepted answer of the time was that science differs from metaphysics in that it is based on observation. It has an empirical method, essentially drawing inductive inferences from the observations and experiments. Popper uses astrology as an example of how this explanation can be inadequate. Astrologers do create a mass of empirical observations, although their craft does not seem to meet a scientific standard. Astrology itself is very old, but other theories were being created during his lifetime. Popper was particularly fascinated by Einstein's theory of relativity as something he considered important. He says that he and others in a small circle of students were thrilled by the results of Eddington's eclipse observation in 1919. It brought about a confirmation of Einstein's theory that light is subject to forces of gravity. This is important for him more in terms of how the confirmation was made than simply the fact that it was made. It is part of the argument he makes for his line of demarcation between genuine and pseudoscience. Now, during daylight hours, our vision of the stars is blocked by the sunlight, but during a total eclipse, the stars become visible again. It was found that during the eclipse, a star appeared to be slightly further away from the sun than positional charts would indicate. It could also be compared to photographs of the star in relation to background stars at night at other times. Popper does not add this, but it would be especially true of photos taken 6 months earlier or later on the other side of the Earth's orbit, when the Earth is between the sun and the star, rather than the other way around. The way that the appearance of a shift in position would occur is if the light from the star was being bent or curved as an effect of the gravitational pull of the sun. The starlight then appears to come from a different spot. Now, as a side note, someone may be wondering if I am assuming or requiring that the hours of day and night must be switched around in a different season. The answer is no, because it takes the Earth 23 hours and 56 minutes to rotate on its axis. But because of the shift in position as it moved in its orbit around the sun, it takes another 4 minutes for a point on the Earth's surface to fully turn to face the sun directly again. Our clocks, based on this 24-hour solar day, is the reason why 2 a.m. is a nighttime hour in all seasons. Other theories becoming popular at that time were Marxist theory of history, Freudian psychoanalysis, and Adler's individual psychology. Popper says he became increasingly dissatisfied by these other theories and increasingly doubted their claims to be scientific. Why do they seem so different from Einstein's theory? He explains that it was not that these theories seemed untrue to him. He says, it was rather that I felt that these other three theories, though posing as sciences, had in fact more in common with primitive myths than with science, that they resembled astrology rather than astronomy. What attracts people to the theories of Marx, Freud, and Adler is their apparent explanatory power, under which they can be used to explain practically anything that might happen. The adherents of these theories always see confirmations or verifications of their theory. Whatever happens becomes something that affirms a truth known to them, but hidden from the rest of us due to our class interests, our repressions, or us crying out for treatment. Popper says about Marxists, for example, that a Marxist could not open a newspaper without finding on every page confirming evidence for his interpretation of history, not only in the news, but also in its presentation, which revealed the class bias of the paper, and especially, of course, in what the paper did not say. He argues that Freud, Adler, and their followers, in similar style, based their confidence in their theories on their clinical observations, which they interpret according to their theories. It is essentially a confirmation bias, as it is called today. Popper does not make this argument, but I would add that these other three theories contradict each other, and therefore cannot all be true. As a result, a methodology that they have in common that allows them all to have this explanatory power cannot be something useful to determine truth and arbitrate disagreements. So the nature of the theories of Marx, Freud, and Adler to be contrasted with Einstein's theory is that, in the case of these others, it becomes, in Popper's words, quote, practically impossible to describe any human behavior that might not be claimed to be a verification of these theories, unquote. In the case of Einstein's theory, it has inherent in it a prediction that might have been verified to be false. If light is subject to gravitational forces, then the path of that stream of light will be bent by the gravity of something as massive as the sun. If the star was observed during an eclipse to be apparently in the same position, Einstein himself probably would have admitted that he made some mistake somewhere. It is because there exists possible results of observation that are incompatible with the theory. We can say that it took a risk by making a clear prediction that could have been seen and acknowledged by all to be false. By contrast, the trick of the psychic fortune tellers is to couch predictions in such vague terms that anything that happens can be a confirmation of it. Now let's say I predict that bad luck will fall upon you tomorrow. Now your assignment for tomorrow is that when anything negative happens in your life, no matter how minor, you are to take it as a confirmation of my prediction. Popper is now in a position to state his theory of demarcation. A genuine scientific theory has several characteristics. It creates prohibitions of certain possible observations that are incompatible with it. The more prohibitions, the better. It is a vice, not a virtue of a theory, if it is effectively irrefutable by virtue of anything being seen as a confirmation. Instead, a relevant observation must be a genuine test of the theory that constitutes an attempt to falsify it. No confirmations of a theory are to count unless they can be presented as a serious and unsuccessful attempt to falsify it. Nothing else is corroborating evidence. Genuine confirmations become a result of a theory that makes risky predictions, such that if I predict that tomorrow, instead of having bad luck in general, a drinking glass will fall from your hand and break on your kitchen floor. He sums this up by saying that, quote, the criterion of the scientific status of a theory is its falsifiability or refutability or testability. Einstein's theory about gravity satisfies this criterion of falsifiability, but clearly astrology cannot. He says that the problem with astrologers is that by making their interpretations and prophecies sufficiently vague, they were able to explain away anything that might have been a refutation of the theory, had the theory and the prophecies been more precise. In order to escape falsification, they destroyed the testability of their theory. It is a typical Soothslayer's trick to predict things so vaguely that the predictions can hardly fail, that they become irrefutable. The two psychoanalytic theories under consideration are simply not testable, at least in their current form, because no human behavior will falsify them. Marxists, however, adopt a form of the astrologer's trickery. Whenever something happens that may refute their theory, they seek to reinterpret both the theory and the evidence to make them agree. By doing so, they destroy the testability of their theory and also destroy its claims to scientific status. Popper also makes the claim that Marx's theory of history has been falsified by historical events, whether or not its adherents choose to recognize it. For the example he explains in his Open Society and Its Enemies, we need to recall that Marx regarded the world of ideas as coming from the economic and material conditions for them. For Marx, ideas are ideologies. They are produced by those material conditions, not the other way around. Now imagine all the machinery and social organization of a society being destroyed, while the knowledge about it survives. We can easily recreate it. However, if the knowledge disappears, while the machinery and organization survives, we have a different scenario. Popper says, quote, this would be tantamount to what would happen if a savage tribe occupied a highly industrialized but deserted country. It would soon lead to the complete disappearance of all the material relics of civilization. unquote. Popper's point here is to show an example of how the history of early Marxism falsifies its own theory. Lenin ended up admitting that aside from the revolution itself, there were no further enthusiastic ideas. So he declared that communism was not just about the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also about the widest introduction of the most modern machinery. The idea then becomes the basis of economic development, reinterpreting the theory to make it irrefutable. Before moving from the issue of demarcation to the issue of the problem of induction, Popper wishes to clarify that his ideas about verification only apply to the issue of demarcation and other philosophy of science issues. His criterion of verifiability is not meant to be a criterion of meaning or significance, as it is for logical positivists. It is especially A.J. Ayer in his book Language, Truth, and Logic, who made famous the theory that any proposition that cannot be verified either by sense experience or by it being true by definition of its terms is literally insignificant, or you could also say cognitively meaningless. Metaphysical propositions such as those affirming or denying God, free will, immortality, reality of mind or matter fall into this category of what is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable, leading Ayer and others to call them meaningless or insignificant. Popper, however, mistakenly attributes this theory to Ludwig Wittgenstein. According to Popper, theories that he calls pseudoscientific are still meaningful, and he even points out that much of what we call science today started with myth and pseudoscientific thinking. He accepts the possibility that something like psychoanalysis may rise to the level of science in the future by being able to make confirmed predictions. As a result, he should not be thought of as a member of the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivists, although he does share some similarities. And this is a good place to clear up another misconception about Popper, that he belongs to the ideological camp of the Frankfurt School neo-Marxists, who attempt to save Marxism from critics by combining it with elements of Freudian psychology. Obviously, that cannot be true if he is arguing that both of these theories are pseudoscience. In The Open Society and Its Enemies, he calls Marxism an oracular philosophy. Popper's politics is a hyper-individualistic version of the classical liberalism of Locke, Mill, and others that ignores membership in society or de-emphasizes membership in society and stresses individual liberty, such as free speech and property rights. Popper's politic inherits the same strengths and weaknesses, including the problem that it cannot explain religious and family commitments or why young men would risk their lives fighting in wars. As for the Frankfurt School, and Herbert Marcuse in particular, they feel a need to pay lip service to liberals and misinterpret their ideas as implying their polar opposite in order to create an impression of following in their footsteps and cash in on their prestige. Popper's paradox of tolerance is a good example of this trickery. When you look at it as it appears in Popper's book, which you see highlighted in bold here if you are watching the long version, Popper says that what we need to be intolerant towards is the violence and censorship advocated by Marcuse in his 1965 Repressive Tolerance. For Popper, the key to understanding his paradox of tolerance is that he could have called it the paradox of free speech, that we gave people freedom to speak in favor of censorship and force. It is precisely that Popper says is what we need to retain the right to suppress if it is made necessary by advocates of censorship denouncing all argument forbidding followers to listen, and teaching to answer arguments with force. This is what makes tolerance paradoxical. Not everything that can be called intolerance creates any kind of paradox. Advocates of cancel culture in Antifa are those who clearly resemble the model of intolerable intolerance that Popper describes. In the academic world, it is the Frankfurt School and postmodernists. Popper sees the problem of demarcation as a key to the solutions to other problems in the philosophy of science. This includes the problem of induction that he now seeks to address. Inductive logic is the process of observing particular instances in the world and generalizing to create a theory that is believed to be universally valid. The problem of induction is one of the elements of the skepticism of David Hume, which holds that we cannot establish, quote, that these instances of which we have no experience resemble those of which we have had experience, unquote. A frequent or constant conjunction of objects does not justify an inference about any object outside of our experience. This would apply, for instance, to inferences related to causality. We see one billiard ball hit another and see the second one move. But we do not see the third element, which is the power of one to force the movement of the other. Inductive inferences like these draw a generalization from instances that fit. Future instances of it are beyond our present experience. The natural law that is being inferred itself is also not part of the experience. Causality then becomes something beyond our experience and is an inference that we make based on the resemblances of previous occurrences. In short, we see it happen that way enough times, and we end up drawing the inference that transcends experience. An attempt to justify this inference by experience would require an infinite series of experiences. Therefore, theories can never be inferred with certainty from observations. This is Hume's logical objection to induction. Hume also creates a psychological explanation of why we draw these inferences in terms of custom or habit. When we perceive ideas that resemble each other, or ideas being otherwise conjoined, we have a habit of associating them in our minds, such that when we perceive one, we will anticipate the other. This is to explain the psychology behind induction. It is also consistent with a traditional picture of how science generates knowledge that says it is based on observation. The scientist formulates theories based on the observations that facilitate a kind of pattern recognition. We can imagine laws of motion, for instance, as inspired by how we see bodies in motion or at rest behave. What Popper will do is to bring four theories into question and seek to revise them. They will be Hume's logical argument against knowledge of the world, his psychological explanation of how we draw inferences, the traditional explanation of demarcation, and the traditional explanation of science creating theories by observation. He will argue ultimately that observation is theory-laden rather than totally passive, meaning that we do not in fact have a completely passive observation that is free of anything we may add, consciously or unconsciously, such as an interpretation. The passivity of observation in the classical empiricism of Hume is based on the assumption of the blank slate at birth, there being nothing in the mind that is not first in the senses. That presupposition will have to fall. Resemblances we see are resemblances that we judge or take to be there. They must be resemblances for us. The psychological picture that Popper will draw about our mental acts of inference by induction will be related to a kind of innate desire to seek laws of nature or regularities. Applying these ideas to the philosophy of science will mean seeing that what the scientist does is not a pattern recognition of those regularities that he infers, but instead is, guess what? Conjectures and refutations. The possibility of refutation brings in an element of deductive reasoning into science, where we can know and prove that a hypothesis is false. The revisions of these four theories will allow demarcation to solve the problem of induction. Hume created a psychological explanation of why we draw our inductive inferences in terms of custom or habit. Popper regards Hume's theory as a causal explanation of a psychological fact that we believe in natural laws and regularities. This fact itself is a custom or habit that needs explanation. What we have so far is the idea that our habit of believing in laws is the product of frequent repetition. Of Popper's three objections, the most important one is that Hume himself admitted that a single striking instance may be sufficient to create a belief or expectation. A puppy gets close to a lit cigarette only once and subsequently avoids them for the rest of his life. This is an example of how Hume's theory cannot be rescued by arguing that it is due to an inductive generalization of early life experiences. Attempts to explain this phenomenon in this way turn out to be a fantasy. Popper says there are also purely logical arguments against Hume's psychological theory. It is a psychology of repetition based on recognized resemblances, leading to the inferences about objects in the world. Popper argues that in order to have an effect, it must be repetition for us and resemblance for us. We must take the representations of objects and events as similar and interpret them as repetitions. Otherwise, the association of ideas would not occur. A puppy seeing a cigarette lit for a second time interprets it as a repetition of the first instance and expects the smell. They are always repetitions from a certain point of view. This point of view cannot itself be a product of repetitions. To avoid the infinite regress, we recognize that there must have been an interpretation of events as repetitions. In other words, similarity or resemblance for us is itself a product of interpretations or expectations. And Popper sums this up by saying that the kind of repetition envisaged by Hume can never be perfect. The cases he has in mind cannot be cases of perfect sameness. They can only be cases of similarity. Thus, they are repetitions only from a certain point of view. What has the effect upon me of a repetition may not have this effect upon a spider. But this means that, for logical reasons, there must always be a point of view, such as a system of expectations, anticipations, assumptions, or interests, before there can be any repetition, which point of view, consequently, cannot be merely the result of repetition. The question remains of how we psychologically obtain our knowledge, if induction is involved. If inference based on repetition of resembling experiences based on habit is not valid, what is the alternative? According to Popper, it is a non-inductive procedure that makes a concession to rationalism, the idea that we can have some knowledge of the world independent of sense experience. The concession he will make to rationalists will be the idea that there can be something innate in the mind that is not first in the senses. It will not be a theory of innate ideas or beliefs that will be affirmed once understood. This Popper thinks to be fundamentally absurd. He says, instead, I propose to turn the tables upon this theory of Hume's. Instead of explaining our propensity to expect regularities as the result of repetition, I proposed to explain repetition for us as the result of our propensity to expect regularities and to search for them. He argues that without waiting for repetitions to impress themselves upon our capacity for pattern recognition, we actively try to impose regularities upon the world. We seek to discover similarities and interpret them in terms of laws invented by us. It does not have to take the form of believing that the world is what we want it to be. When we jump to conclusions, we can still discard those conclusions if later experience or facts invalidate them. It is a trial and error of conjectures and refutations. It explains how our interpretations of the world are logically prior to the observations of regularities. Popper talks about a distinction between a dogmatic and a critical attitude, with the critical attitude being the one to apply to the situation to create genuine science. It is the dogmatic attitude of Marxists and other soothsayers that will confirm the hypothesis, if only through reinterpretations that save it. For the scientists, it does mean that theories must be regarded as tentative. But the good news about it is that the critical attitude applied to the situation means that the theories are subject to a rule of survival of the fittest. The traditional explanation that science gives us knowledge from observation alone without any theory is absurd. Popper's argument for this asks a simple and solvable question. Which came first, the hypothesis or the observation? We know the answer to the chicken and egg question is that they are both here due to a slightly different kind of egg. Likewise, a different kind of hypothesis precedes the hypothesis and the observations. Observation itself does not exist in a vacuum or appear out of nowhere. It comes from some interest, some goal, some problem to solve, some point of view. It is by being related to needs or interests that objects get classified by us as similar or dissimilar. The scientist is no exception to this rule, even if sometimes bare satisfaction of curiosity may be his only goal. Whatever obscurities may precede the hypothesis that is an attempt to explain them presupposes the adoption of some kind of frame of reference, frame of theories, or expectations. If we have inborn reactions and responses, then Popper's theory does not require an infinite regress, as would be required if expectations were only ever themselves products of observations. Popper argues that newborns show this tendency to expect regularities and have other expectations. For instance, they expect to be fed. Popper does not give examples, but he also suggests that small children are satisfied when finding regularities. He says that the instinct to find regularities is part of our mental outfit and is thus a priori valid. This means that it is psychologically and logically prior to all experience. He sums up this part with a mental exercise of imagining an induction machine. In order for it to work, we, as the machine's makers, would have to program into it a framework for interpreting the world, what it will take as similar, and what kind of laws the machine will be able to discover. The machine metaphor is very apt here, because what Popper is doing is disputing a presupposition that is inherent in classical empiricism, that we are entirely disinterested recorders of observation and passive recorders of observations that are assumed to be unambiguous. He is not alone in this, and the questioning of this and some other aspects of empiricism, even by people who call themselves empiricists, becomes a theme in what might be called a late period of analytic philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. Analytic philosophy becomes willing to talk about linguistic and conceptual frameworks that make observation statements theory-laden. In terms of science in actual practice, one might be tempted to ask how we jump from observation statements to a theory. According to Popper, it is a jump from a problem situation to the theory. The theory must allow us to explain the observations that for us are the problem situation. The real question should be one of how to jump from observation statements to a good theory. We do this by jumping to any theory, testing it to see if it is good, and eliminating bad theories. According to Popper, what these considerations point to is that the problems of induction and demarcation are actually one. He believes that what he has argued about proper demarcation allows him to cash in with a solution to induction. He says that when he asks scientists why they believe that science can give us knowledge, he says, they believed that the difference between genuine science and metaphysical or pseudoscientific speculation depended solely upon whether or not the inductive method was employed. They believed, to put it in my own terminology, that only the inductive method could provide a satisfactory criterion of demarcation. So belief in induction is fortified by the need for a criterion of demarcation. But it is mistaken to believe that only the inductive method can provide it. If Popper is right, a rule of valid induction does not exist. Induction is a myth, and science actually operates by conjectures. The alternative he proposes is to picture the success of science as depending upon luck, ingenuity, and purely deductive rules. The solution to the problem of induction is only a facet of the solution of demarcation. It has to do with the fact that experiments can falsify a conjecture. If this is granted, the solution to demarcation in the form of conjectures and refutations solves the problem of induction. In his argument for this, Popper distinguishes three principles of the logical problem of induction. The first, principle A, is Hume's discovery that a law cannot be proven by observation or experiment. A second principle, B, is that science proposes and uses laws all the time. And principle C is the principle of empiricism, which is that only observation and experiment can decide the acceptance or rejection of a law or theory. The apparent clash of these three is the logical problem of induction. But really there is no clash, according to Popper, between A and C if the proclaimed laws and theories of science are only tentative and subject to rejection on the basis of new evidence. When tested, the rejection of the theory that is falsified by observation is by a deductive inference. Now, to give some clarity to the idea of a deductive inference being used in falsifying a theory, I will consider what happens when we switch a categorical proposition from being universal and positive to one that is particular and negative. Scientific theories are rarely presented as this type of proposition, but they can be, and the idea of refutation is the same. Here is something known as the traditional square of opposition. Note the diagonal line labeled as contradictories. The universal proposition of all S's P will always have the opposite truth value than the negative, in particular, some S is not P. If some or a particular lawyer is not a shyster, then this means it cannot be true that all of them are shysters, even if some of them are. This is a deductive logic behind the idea of refutation by counterexample, which proves that the stated rule is not universally valid. Likewise, if some lawyers are shysters, it would mean that the universal proposition that none of them are shysters would have to be false. Thus, observations can disprove a theory, despite the fact that observation cannot prove the theory. Successful scientific theories are those that survived attempted refutations by a deductive method of proving a generalization wrong by counterexample. This justifies our belief in science as reasonable or rational because Popper says, quote, "Our belief in a particular natural law cannot have a safer basis than our unsuccessful critical attempts to refute it," unquote. So has Popper solved the great philosophical problem of induction? In the way he advertises that he had done so, he says there is no clash between Hume's theory of observation, of it not proving natural law, and the principle of empiricism. Yet it looks like Popper cannot maintain his principle of empiricism, as he puts it, as meaning that only observation and experiment can decide the acceptance or rejection of a law or theory. He adds a deductive principle to the acceptance or rejection of a law or theory. I would also argue that he does not give Hume proper credit for taking at least partly the same position as he does, that it is rational to believe in laws or theory, despite the fact that they cannot be proven to be absolutely certain for all time. In his treatise of human nature, Hume does give guidelines for drawing causal inferences in ways that are not falsified at the time the inference is made. They are effectively a predecessor of John Stuart Mill's canons of induction. Popper's originality on induction might only be his connecting it with falsifiability and potentially making explicit what was only hinted at in the works of his predecessors. So my position ends up being this. If by solving the problem of induction, we mean proving that induction gives us an absolute certainty, Popper takes the position that it cannot be solved. If by solving the problem, we mean creating a justification for believing in the results as rational or reasonable, it is not Popper's discovery. Another alternative was presented by Ayer, that the problem may be technically unsolvable, but nevertheless our faith in induction is nevertheless justified by it allowing us to predict future events and control the environment, which is exactly the point of having sciences. This is not inconsistent with Popper's idea of trial and error when errors get corrected over time. On the issue of demarcation, I have a tendency to think his argument is not as strong as it could be. In the Eddington observation, we have the situation of a footprints in the snow chain of reasoning. If you go outside in the morning after the snowfall and find rabbit tracks in the snow, you will be convinced that a rabbit went across your yard without seeing the rabbit. It is because the world is observed to be what it would be if the rabbit was there. Same with the Eddington observations during the eclipse. The observation was what it would be if light were subjected to forces of gravity. Had it not been the case, it may have gotten Einstein to change his mind. I think there is strength in Popper's theory precisely here. We could always ask of someone what kind of observation or event, if it occurs, will actually get him to change his mind and abandon his theory. True science, when done honestly, should be able to give an answer. Any kind of thinking to be scientific or rational should also consider it in keeping with what Popper says about taking a critical rather than a dogmatic attitude. For instance, Richard Dawkins provided an answer when he wrote in The God Delusion that he would abandon his belief in evolution if the fossil of a Precambrian rabbit was found to be the same as today's rabbit. It is a mindset that sees willingness to change one's mind as a virtue rather than a weakness. It helps to create the situation where the world that we observe around us is what it would be if our opinions were correct. Politically, it means seeing that experiments and theories being tested happens around us all the time, although the people shown to be wrong don't want to see it that way. In the first year of COVID, Sweden sent its children back to school in September with no requirement to wear masks. Many other countries continued the requirement, but were no better off. Communist dictatorship has similarly been put to the test of a controlled experiment, comparing North and South Korea, East and West Germany. With second cousins on the other side of the border, other factors of ethnicity, language, and culture are held equal. The world looks to me like it would be if freedom was the better alternative. Popper does not argue this, but I think it is consistent with what he says about demarcation. For this reason, Marxists, Covidians, and haters of free speech seem to me to have more in common with the astrologer than the astronomer, and a different set of results is what I would need to get me to change my opinion. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, check out my other videos on my channel page and see what you're missing. Thanks for watching.